the attitude, all the opinion, all the information, all the debate. Now, the Leighton Smith Podcast, powered by NewsTalkZB.
Welcome to Podcast 176 for 12 October 2022. Guy Hatchard is an independent thinker. He doesn't subscribe to groupthink, doesn't comply with the official narrative unless the data confirms its accuracy, which frequently it doesn't. A lot of people encouraged me to have him on the podcast, and I responded once or twice that I had reservations, and I did. But on October 7, Hatchard published something that triggered this interview. Here is part of it. We have been discussing disturbing findings reported in learned scientific journals for over a year. But because of government control over a wide range of social institutions and the media, the public remains in the dark. How did this happen? Is something amiss with our system of government and the control it wields? For decades, successive governments have felt a paternalistic need to impose uniform approaches on various public institutions. This has particularly affected education, health, employment, science, and the management of risk. Various bodies like the Advertising Standards Authority, the Employment Relations Authority, the Accident Compensation Commission, the courts, etc., are tasked with administering legislation fairly. All of these bodies are funded by the Crown and therefore subject to varying degrees of ministerial control. You will know that if you've spent any time over the years listening to me that I have thoughts and feelings about, well, let's call it, for the sake of brevity, the administrative state. And that's exactly what all of the above refers to. He writes further, Ardern's government realised that under the law they could, if they wished, exercise great power over the decisions of these supposedly independent public institutions. They did wish to do so. Rapidly, all of our public institutions fell into line with ministerial directives and the pronouncements of Prime Minister Ardern and her cabinet. Courts ruled that they were obliged to follow government policy and set aside the provisions of the New Zealand Bill of Rights. The Accident Compensation Commission, a universal personal insurance scheme, denied compensation to many affected by COVID vaccination. Schools and the tertiary education sector rigorously imposed vaccine mandates and restricted educational access to the unvaccinated. Now, I have been opposed from the very beginning to mandating vaccination. I believe in personal choice. It's simply a matter that we should not be interfered with in our personal choices over what we put into our body. I'm very determined about it and remain so. And there are others that he refers to, including, finally, dissenting doctors were excluded from the medical profession. That, in my humble opinion, is arguably the greatest sin of all. The hour that Guy and I spent discussing things I found very interesting, and I believe that you will also, and you'll let me know otherwise, or whichever way. Now, I want to transfer attention to somebody else that I have interviewed in the past. Gigi Foster, who is an American, but she's a professor of economics at the University of New South Wales. And the interview that I did with her was very informative in that I learned a great deal about why economists have a role to play. In fact, anybody outside the medical profession is not necessarily excluded from having input and valuable input into crises like we have been dealing with regard to COVID. Let me make this transfer by referring to a column that I wrote for the Herald when this first came to light and the government was talking about and planning on imposing restrictions on our lives. And I said something along the lines that I can understand it, but the most important thing is that these moves that the government makes, what they impose on us, should be removed as soon as possible, and they should have a time restriction put on them. So how do you think that's going? So back to Gigi Foster, who, along with the other two who wrote the book that caused me to interview her, The Great COVID Panic, Gigi Foster, Paul Freachers, and Michael Baker have written a column that was published on Brownstone back in June 27. A new Western religion takes shape. Keep in mind what I just said about governments imposing restrictions on us that should have a limited lifespan. Leaders in the West have been very busy these last 12 months setting up international institutions, regulations and technologies that legitimize, formalize and entrench the powers they have gained during lockdowns. They've got their central banks devising protocols for implementing new digital currencies that simplify surveillance of their population's financial transactions. Vaccine-based ID systems, such as the EU's digital COVID certificate, the Hong Kong Health Code, and Australia's digital passenger declaration, that make tracking individuals across and within countries easier. And CO2 budgets and social credit systems that can be used to adjudicate who is worthy of travel and a reasonable standard of living, and who is not. Western politicians went way out on a limb during the COVID period in suspending normal liberties and controlling people's daily lives. Their authoritarianism was so extreme that in retrospect, its legitimacy needed to be cemented in Western eyes via a permanent set of internationally coordinated command and control structures. These would provide a bulwark against challenges in and out of court, protecting the backsides of COVID-era politicians and also furthering their careers. Their re-election prospects will improve because voters are more likely to keep swallowing the ideological sales pitch if it is seen to be supported by a global consensus. The new global institutions, politicians hope, will assist in ensuring the flock remains deeply obedient to their leaders, is preoccupied with self-loathing, and continues to be wary of any fellow man with whom they might have organised resistance. This new Western order being established by our leaders is akin to a religious order, which preserves the neo-feudal ideology that came of age during COVID, while keeping the masses divided. Now, you can take or leave that whichever way you want, but I think there's a great deal of truth to it.
Leighton Smith.
Guy Hatchard, PhD, is London-born, but he came to New Zealand. In fact, he came to New Zealand, I discovered, 2 years before me. He arrived in 1978, and I came, work it out for yourself. The fact that he has been building a profile as, well, I'll let him interpret it, but I would say he's mostly called an anti-vaxxer. He is held in disfavour by those in authority. But he is from my observation, he is a fighter. And if nothing else, he's certainly, in my opinion, more right than he might be wrong. And it took a while to decide to interview Guy Hatchard. But a few days ago I did. And there was good reason for it. I think he deserves it for a start. I think he's been given a rough time by some of the media. Rather than investigating, they've been doing hit jobs. Let's just put it that way. Guy Hatchard, it's good to have you on the podcast. Thank you.
Hello, Leighton. Good to be here. And thank you for interviewing me. You're a brave man.
Do you think?
Well, I think we need brave people.
Nothing.
Because we have a information vacuum on the topic that we'll be discussing.
Well, if you go to Amazon and look for anything that you've published, you find that you're in the same category, at least they seem to pitch you in, with Peter McCullough, who I have admiration for, Robert Malone, ditto, Robert Kennedy, I'm a bit wary, Matthias Desmet, and Alex Epstein. And they are all, shall we say, anti-narrative, as are you. Would you care? Why don't you start with just reminding us of your qualifications and why you're where you're at?
Well, I have a PhD in psychology, but I'm not a clinical psychologist. I do research on social indicators, and I have a long-standing interest in natural health and food safety. I used to work for Genetic ID. Genetic ID is a company that tests food for safety and content and certifies bulk food shipments and retail products as free of genetic engineering. So I have a long-standing association with people working in genetic engineering, in gene therapy, and my primary focus is on safety.
But you're not an epidemiologist, therefore you've got no right to comment on anything to do with COVID.
Well, that's a narrative, isn't it? I would put it another way. I would say that we don't have a lot of expertise here on biotechnology safety. And that's a missing piece in the jigsaw of in the pandemic response. In fact, one of the two lead scientists who were looking at the approval of the vaccine was actually an expert on lamb rearing. So we do have a lot of expertise here in agriculture, but the point that biotechnology was unsafe, inherently unsafe, and there was a lot of evidence for that. This was missed.
What else might have been missed?
Well, there was an assumption right from the start that vaccination was the gold standard of medicine and therefore couldn't be questioned.
Well, just hold it there. I want to take you back to 2017 when I think it was the second edition, of the New Zealand Influenza Pandemic Plan, a framework for action, was in place. Well, it wasn't just New Zealand. This was worldwide, but this was the New Zealand plan. It never saw the light of day when we had a pandemic, or when a pandemic was called, or when we thought one was coming. So this plan, which of course cost lots of money to set up in the first place, just was non-existent. It was ignored. You might even say it was trashed. Why?
The whole landscape of the medical regulatory environment has been changing rapidly over the last decade. And this is due to an increased reliance on international databases. So MedSafe, for example, is a member of the International Coalition of Medicine's Regulatory Authorities. So it's not a governmental body, it's an international body. They link around the globe, and a lot of their information comes, in fact, the majority of their information comes from the pharmaceutical industry and the World Health Organization. And so when forming policy, a lot of it is channeled directly into the middle of the government machinery from the sort of unregulated global international space, where people who have huge commercial interests, like big pharmaceutical companies, wield enormous influence. So these kinds of setups, and there are many like this. There's the Global Alliance for Vaccination and Immunization, Gavi, and the World Health Organization, and so on, sort of have in many ways taken over government policies all around the world. And that's why you've seen that the response in every country was pretty much the same, and the kind of references and information that we saw, and there weren't very many scientific references, by the way, were pretty similar around the world. And so, yes, things were forgotten, and the response was very uniform, and it didn't take account of safety. It swallowed the pill. 2017, right? We were formulating our response. Well, in 2017, the CEO of Moderna was giving talks, TED Talks, talks all around the world about how mRNA vaccination was going to cure all diseases and cancer. And this kind of promotional fantasy, actually, without any mention of the safety issues, which were huge, was changing people's mindset, changing the narrative around the world, and conditioning people to accept a big change in medicine.
The state of Florida's Surgeon General, Joseph Ladapo, published an analysis warning men aged 18 to 39 from taking mRNA vaccines due to a statistically significant increase in cardiac-related deaths. And Twitter,
it was very interesting.
And Twitter removed it. They put it back, but they removed it. What does that say?
It's really the changing face of science, isn't it? Science has become trumped by politics and commercial endeavor. And in this case, the reason that this Florida advisory was issued was based on a scientific study of many hundreds of thousands of people, of medical records in Florida of people who died. And they analyzed the records And what they found was that in the 28 days after vaccination, the rate of people dying was elevated. So this is a very standard kind of method that's used to assess the effect of vaccination. And they pinned it down to particularly that age range of 18 to 39 for males. They basically found that there were 80% more deaths among males in that age bracket in the 28 days after vaccination. So it's a way of distinguishing what is going on that's unusual, and then the government acted upon it. On the other side of America, in California, in the same week, you saw legislation passed that would automatically disbar doctors if they said the opposite of what they said in Florida, if they started to say, well, not the opposite, if they agreed with Florida. So that's America for you, a very patchy response there.
Yes, but it's not only America, because this week, on the 11th, in fact, of October, the Queensland Parliament is likely to pass a piece of legislation that goes even further.
I don't know. I'm not aware of it. But, again, for me, it's politics. I see there was a report here recently, last week, in the Herald, which I think it was by Jamie Morton, which said that the vaccination program here has saved an enormous number of lives. And then it referenced a Ministry of Health directive. I looked at that. It didn't have a single scientific reference in it. That kind of pronouncement was not supported. It's not supported by the COVID publishing. And then I looked at the Australian Technical Advisory Group, Therapeutic Goods Authority, which is the equivalent of MedSafe over there. And I looked at their advisory on the COVID, and they had something like 50 references, but they all went back to mid-2021, just after the vaccine started to be rolled out. They were out of date. There's been a lot of publishing. It's an enormous amount of COVID publishing that's going on in learned scientific journals. And the narrative has moved on. Well, not the narrative, it's the data. We have more data. And the data is quite alarming. For example, I'll just give you one example. This week, under court order, the CDC, the Center for Disease Control in the US, released data it had been hiding. Now, they have had a program throughout the pandemic where 10 million people have enrolled through their cell phones in a program to report vaccine side effects. And they had, ICANN had to sue the government twice in order to get its release. It was released, and the results were frankly frightening.
Why did it take so long in your estimation, sir?
It's a very good question. Why did it take numerous legal demands, multiple appeals, 2 lawsuits, in fact, before the CDC finally handed over the vSafe data, which is already de-identified data for the most part that they provided just 2 days ago, 144 million lines of code that they could have provided in a matter of minutes at any point? It's a great question. Maybe the answer is that now that we have that data and we've looked at that data, of the 10 million users within vSafe, 7.7% of them had to seek medical care after vaccination. That is an incredibly high percentage, it appears to me.
Yeah, and if I can, sir, I just want to put this graphic up to kind of follow along with you. You're right, 7.7 required medical care. We're talking about emergency rooms, hospitalizations. There it is right there. And on top of that, not to go you one better, but this is your information, another 2.5 million, we're talking 25%, missed work or school or had bad reactions to the vaccine.
So 7.7% of vSafe users had a health event requiring medical attention, emergency room intervention, and or hospitalization following vaccination. That's huge.
But I'd like to know the breakdown of that. The first sector there that you mentioned, I would think would be the biggest number.
You can, yes, could possibly be. Well, 25% had an event that required them to miss school or work and or prevented normal activities. But you actually can find out if you want, because the entire database is now been published by ICANN, and you can access it and analyze it. And of course, this week, people are very, very busy looking at that database, which involves 10 million users making reports. So the actual number of volume of reports is probably around 100 million. There are going to be published analysis of this coming out.
All right. So of that 10 million, we will find out sooner or later that X number died.
Yes. Well, I'm not sure if you're a cell phone user, you can report if you died. But you can report something that happened to you that left you alive. I want to contrast that with what's happening here because I received a letter in December 2021 from Astrid Corney, who's director of our National Immunization Program. She was writing on behalf of Dr. Ashley Bloomfield, replying to me. And she said, an accurate measurement of all adverse events is not required. And this, to me, is the nub of the problem. There was, as I said, an assumption of safety. There was an assumption that everything was going to be all right. And in fact, a member of the SCEG committee also wrote to me, and there are 8 members of the SCEG committee who are advising the government on vaccine safety, and he admitted that there were problems, but he felt sure that they would get it right in the end.
Well, I'm asking you to do somebody else's job, but on what basis were they making those assumptions?
Well, that's, I believe, is simply the assumption that it would be all right, that vaccination does work. There was a failure to distinguish between traditional vaccination and an intervention in the way our genetics works. So DNA expresses itself through RNA. So the interface between the whole physiology, all our organ systems, in the, involving trillions of cells in the body, is the way the RNA relays information from the DNA to the physiology. Now change that, which is what mRNA vaccination was doing, and you can potentially affect all the organs in the body. There was no realization that there was a lot of risk. There was an assumption of safety, and that has caused all kinds of problems down the line, and very specific problems. Many people have been affected by this vaccination program, but are unaware that their health issues are the result of vaccination because, again, another slip up. There were people in CVTAG, that's the COVID Vaccine Technical Advisory Group, the body of 12 people that advises our government, who were expressing reservations. But when we listened to Ardern on the podium of truth, we only got it's safe and effective.
The vaccine we are using in New Zealand is safe and effective. If you are vaccinated, it means that you are less likely to catch the virus and much less likely to end up in hospital if you do.
So there was a failure of communication. It was either a failure of communication or there was a deliberate decision somewhere in the machinery of government to gloss over the risks, which were serious.
Well, I make no apology for going for the latter.
Yes. Yeah, I think that's quite likely. But then there was a lack of bravery on the part of those who were advising the government, or a lack of thoroughness. And there was also, because of this assumption of safety, that the MedSafe and Ministry of Health were not rigorously keeping track of what was happening. So I'll say the sentence again. An accurate measurement of all adverse events is not required. Well, looking at myocarditis, pericarditis, myocarditis, inflammation of the heart, then there was a lot of confusion in the data. So we had 274 hospital discharges for myocarditis in the year ending March 2020, which is pre-pandemic. And then the next year, which was pre-vaccination, there were 343. Next year, corresponding to the vaccination rollout, we had 783 cases reported by MedSafe. Now, you have to ask yourself, clearly it increased, but is that figure real? Now, if you go to official information requests, there were actually 1,540 hospital discharges in 2021 for myocarditis, twice the rate reported by MedSafe. So people were not being careful. It should have raised alarm bells, and it didn't. And again, you can come to a sequence of numbers which shows you what was going on. July 2021, and this is a post in MedSafe, and it's still up. It says that the estimated rate of myocarditis is 1 per million vaccine doses. Mm-hmm. In December 2021, Ashley Bloomfield wrote to the heads of the district health boards. He claimed the rate was 30 per million. And the actual reported rate, which we've just discussed, this 1540, was somewhere between 75 and 150 per million, and probably higher. Now, again, that there was if you look at some of the communications, it's clear that people were claiming that, myocarditis, it's very rare. And people were also saying, you're more risk of myocarditis if you actually have COVID than if you have the vaccine.
The vaccine is a very safe vaccine, and that any small risk associated with the vaccine is by far outweighed by the risk of getting COVID-19.
Although this particular case was probably associated with the vaccination, it is extremely rare internationally, and the risks of getting COVID, which itself can cause myocarditis, as the Minister has said, certainly outweigh that.
Another important one that's talked about a lot, and it is important, is the risk of heart inflammation. Mm-hmm. You've probably heard of this. It's called myocarditis. Mm-hmm. And that again is a very rare side effect. Mm. But also we have to balance it up about the risk of the virus itself. Mm. And so the risk is far higher if you get COVID-19.
Both of these things were wrong. There was a very good study done in Israel which found that, and I quote from that study, it's called The Incidence of Myocarditis and Pericarditis in Post-COVID-19 Unvaccinated Patients, a large population-based study. And the conclusion says, we did not observe an increased incidence of pericarditis or myocarditis in adult patients recovered from COVID-19. So at that point, there should have been alarm bells going off in the Ministry of Health. There should have been, now wonder what's going on. They could have intervened and started to measure what was going on accurately, but they didn't. That was a huge mistake.
Is there a number that you would agree with of people affected that was acceptable because of the benefits to the majority? So in a million, instead of 7 or 8, would it be 20, 25, 50? Is there any figure that you would think would be acceptable?
I think we just have to go to the past, and we have to look at when were traditionally with vaccines alarm bells rung? And they were around 2 per million. The most dangerous vaccine that has been approved prior to COVID was smallpox, with a death rate of 2 per million. And what that does is it just triggers a process. If you get deaths after a new medical intervention, it triggers a process of going back, reassessing the evidence, looking more carefully at what the outcomes were, and finding out whether this was a unusual case, how does it compare to the background rate, and so on. Well, MedSafe did do something. They did start a process of comparing the background rate, historical background rate of myocarditis and various other conditions to the rate that they were observing. But what they did was they simply looked at CALM reports. So CALM is the Adverse Effect Reporting Centre in New Zealand. The Ministry of Health itself says that only about 5% of adverse effects are reported, and that's consistent around the world, that very few people do get round to quite a complex reporting system. So if you only compare it to that, you're missing out on 95% of what's going on. The only way around that is to do a prospective study, and that kind of study has been done. So a Thai study of 300 students prospective means they hadn't been vaccinated. They assembled those people, they vaccinated them, and then they followed what happened. And they found that 2.33% of these students had, that's 7 of the 300, exhibited at least one elevated cardiac biomarker or positive lab assessment, indicating that they had had some kind of heart event. That is a rate of 23,000 per million, not 30 per million, as Ashley Bloomfield suggested. That's...
How many did you say? 23,000?
That rate is
yes.
23,000 per million.
Why is it not being pulled when other vaccines, swine flu vaccine 1976 was pulled because it caused Guillain-Barré syndrome in 1 in 100,000? Rotavirus vaccine was pulled in 1999 because it caused a form of bowel obstruction, 1 in 10,000. We're talking of serious adverse events of 1 in 800.
What are we doing here? I have friends. I live in a remote location. Don't see that many people because they're very spread out here in Northern, where we are. But I have several friends who've had chest pains, cardiac issues, who've never been to their doctor. I have a daughter-in-law who had tachycardia, chest pains, felt very ill after vaccination, who went to the hospital and was simply sent home and said, "Oh, you are anxious, don't worry about it."
I want to get on to anxious before too long too, from a different perspective. But the fact that you get, a lot of people have got chest pains, but they survive, they pass. Am I right?
Yes, most people with myocarditis will recover over time. They might, if it's serious episode, there might be scarring of the heart. There might be some health issues. There have been some follow-up studies on young children in California, for example. A study found that out of 8 children, I think, that were followed up, there were a couple who still had issues after a year. But now look at the kind of narrative that's gone around is that you will recover, it will be okay. But again, look at the scientific publishing. So a UK study completed just before the pandemic found that for people who had acute myocarditis, that's a serious case of myocarditis, the mortality rate was around 4%. So 4% of people die as a result of complications. However, if these cases are caught early and treated, people have a good chance of recovering. Now, there you are. We were not counting people accurately. We were turning people away from hospitals, and doctors were saying, "Don't worry, But the underlying understanding of the condition of heart inflammation is it's very important to treat it as early as you can. That is a mistake that was made here.
What is the time period that would be required to pass so that once you got to that point, you knew you weren't going to have a problem?
There are simple tests that could have been done. There's a troponin test, for example.
But what I'm thinking of is people that are listening now are saying...
I get it.
So what do you think?
I think they should have a troponin test. A troponin test will uncover whether there's been some kind of more serious cardiac event. It's a simple test. It's not costly. As I said, it's done routinely in US hospitals. It could be done routinely here to determine the extent of the problem and identify anyone who's had a undiagnosed heart incident that needs attention. There might be some instructions about, there might be medication, but there might also be instructions about exercise and so on and so forth. I'm not a medical doctor, but the response of medical doctors needs to up their game. The Ministry of Health needs to up their game on this issue.
I want to go back to the beginning of this particular discussion. In the Australian on 7 October, Ramesh Thakur wrote the following. Efforts to control the pandemic narrative began with the systematic suppression of any suggestion that it might have originated in a research lab of the Wuhan Institute of Virology, then moved on to denigrate, silence, and smear critics of lockdowns, masks, and vaccine efficacy and mandates. That refers, of course, to the efforts to control the pandemic narrative. A bill up for debate in the Queensland Parliament on October 11 takes censorship to another level. If successful, it will fundamentally reshape the relationship between doctors, patients, and health regulators. The Australian Medical Network says under the new law, health bureaucrats will determine how doctors should approach treatment recommendations for their patients, and health regulators will be given the power to sanction doctors for expressing their professional opinion based on their assessment of the best available science. It then refers to the California legislature that you referred to before, so I won't, but says, so now it's official. They have outlawed opinions. Having overturned 100 years of settled science and policy orthodoxy on pandemic management with COVID, we are on the cusp of revolutionising the everyday practice of medicine by subordinating the professional judgment of doctors on the best treatment options for their patients to the directives of bureaucrats and health regulators. Comment?
Well, Queensland, I'd moved to New South Wales.
But hold it, because somewhere further on in this article, I think it's in the article, if it wasn't, it was somewhere else, there is the opinion, let me see if I can find this quickly. If not paused and stopped, this will affect every Australian to the detriment of public health.
Yes, I agree. I agree totally.
But somewhere lawyers have made comment that this is somehow likely to be adopted Australia-wide.
It could well be, because there's, when I think we're familiar with this syndrome, it's very hard to express an incorrect opinion, but once you've expressed it and gone down that route, it's very hard to change tack. And again, I think this narrative has got disconnected from the published scientific thread that is going on. So science is a process where there's a lot of debate, there's a lot of publishing, there's a lot of testing and retesting until you get settled science. And in this case, we're seeing bureaucratic decisions overturning scientific ideas. So let's just take where Ramesh started out with his article. He talked about the lab leak theory of COVID origin. Well, just a month ago now, by looking through past blood samples, it was realized that COVID was widely circulating in September of 2019 before anyone had ever heard of it. And then yesterday, the Daily Telegraph in the UK published an article, an expose article that in 2019, China had been buying up PPE, personal protective equipment, in massive stocks of personal protective equipment. It seems clear, and this fits with the lab leak origin, because in around that time earlier on in the year, sort of more around mid-2019, people in the Wuhan lab had this strange outbreak of illness. Now, for me, the implication of this, and this is very important, is that both the vaccinated and the unvaccinated have a common cause here. COVID, as far as I can see, and I have colleagues in gene therapy who agree with me, and these are senior researchers, it seems to me that COVID probably came out of a lab. If COVID came out of a lab and the vaccine came out of the lab, and they both have a engineered spike protein, aren't we both suffering, vaccinated and unvaccinated, from the same mistake? Mm-hmm. Don't we have a common cause? Look at this spike protein. It's highly toxic. It's got very unusual components, some of which were patented components, so already known to science, all joined together in an unusual configuration. Seems to me that this is unregulated biotechnology that we're fighting here. And this is more into area where I have definite contribution to make to the debate, is that genetic material is highly mobile. It can affect the whole physiology. And we're seeing studies now coming out that the spike protein travels freely in the body. It affects the blood-brain barrier. It affects organs, reproductive organs, kidney, liver. There are serious issues that are being researched and coming to light week by week, actually, at this point. And we need to curb unregulated biotechnology experimentation. It's dangerous.
The virus, as we understand it, has a dangerous part to it. Those are the red buds that you see there. It's called the spike protein. These spike proteins, these red buds, had been genetically altered and engineered in a lab in Wuhan, China, to be particularly infectious and to be particularly dangerous when they get in the human body. The last thing you want in your body is one of those red buds, let alone billions of them, because those red buds basically damage the brain, they damage the heart, they damage the bone marrow, they can tear up platelets and red blood cells. Very importantly, they damage blood vessels and cause blood clotting. It's all about the spike protein. The vaccines, and what's shown on the right there is Pfizer and Moderna. They're messenger RNA vaccines. On the left is Johnson & Johnson, outside the United States, AstraZeneca. These vaccines inject genetic material into the human cells, and then the cells produce the red buds, as shown here, the dangerous spike protein.
The other problem, and this is your area of expertise, is that what these vaccines do is they encode spike protein alone, so that the immune system will learn to recognize spike protein and will catch it quickly when one is confronted with COVID. But the spike protein itself, we now know, is very dangerous. It's cytotoxic. Is that a fair description?
More than fair, and I alerted the FDA about this risk months and months and months ago.
What's happened is nothing short of astonishing. This paper, done at Harvard School of Medicine, after the release of the vaccines, once they're on the market, proved that the spike protein circulates in the blood after vaccination for 1 to 15 days on average. The longest is 29 days. Now, when these were presented at the US FDA meetings back in November, there was research done at the Salk Institute. They said, no, the vaccine just stays in the arm. It doesn't go anywhere. The spike protein doesn't go anywhere. and said, listen, this doesn't make sense. In fact, the Japanese, by March, had demanded Pfizer do a study showing, listen, show us where it goes. And Pfizer did a biodistribution study in animals, and it does go everywhere in animals. And what's really disturbing in the Pfizer study is it concentrates in the ovaries of animals.
You wrote in another of your missives, in your essays, of the social compact having been broken because pandemic policies have imposed harm on individuals and society.
Yes, I think the social compact.
What was the social compact you're referring to? Trust?
Well, the social compact was an idea that came out of the philosophers Locke and Hobbes and Rousseau in the 18th century, where basically they said there was an unwritten social contract, or in modern context it's often referred to as a compact, where people agree that they can disagree, that people can have different opinions. They can discuss them and reach resolution, and the government has a duty of care to the people, and the people in turn support the government as long as they're being properly cared for. So it's an acceptance of difference in society, that different people will live together. But implicit in this is that the government is not going to do harm to the people. And in fact, if you look in history, whenever a government starts to set upon very harmful or repressive policies, then you do have a breakdown in social order. You introduce instability into society. And I think this action in Queensland that we just discussed is an example of imposing a certain amount of harm on the population, and this breaks the social compact.
And leads to what, do you think?
I think it leads ultimately it leads to a breakdown of trust. You said it. And when trust breaks down, there are all sorts of flow-on consequences from that. If you don't trust your government, you're going to be looking for alternative ways of thinking. Look what happened in the great Wall Street crash. The repercussions of that in Germany. 6 million people unemployed, and people moved away from the center into extremes. There were, extreme parties. You saw the rise of extreme ideas. So trust is very, very important, and trust has to be.
You're going back to the Great Depression.
Yes, it led to extreme. It led to extremes, particularly in Europe, which was very badly affected.
Yes. All right. So at this point, we're watching Europe change its attitude, state by state. Italy, of course, being the most recent. Now, Nothing that's happened so far in Finland or in Finland or in Italy, bothers me in the slightest. In fact, I think it's a damn good thing. The more, the better. But at this point, there is no sign or indication at all, as far as I'm aware, of anything developing into the 30s era reaction that you're referring to.
Well, I'm glad to hear it.
Well, of course.
but I do feel that these things take time to develop. The repercussions of this, we've seen rises in all-cause mortality. We've seen economic impacts of the pandemic and the possible effects of that. Where it's going to go, we're not sure. And we still don't know the long-term effects of vaccination on health. And these are questions. I'm not posing answers to these, simply saying that there are some unanswered questions that could have some quite serious long-term impacts. We don't know what they are. And we have to say that a traditional vaccine takes 10 to 12 years to develop. And the reason is that gives us a chance to assess if there are any serious long-term impacts, such as increases in cancer and so on. That process hasn't gone on with this vaccine. And that means that there are long-term questions of health. So public health data that really is necessary to do definitive research on what is the impact of the pandemic and what is the impact of vaccination has not been released to the public. So there are questions. We've had this high level of all-cause mortality this year. So it's about 35% running above. In July, it was running 35% above historical levels. In order to determine what is causing this, we need information, public health information about cause of death, vaccination status, and age. That information for the whole population cohort. Now, apparently that information has been released to GVDN. I have a problem with that because if you look up GVDN and you see what the directors have been saying about it as an organization, it is an organization designed to combat vaccine hesitancy. In other words, it's an organization, an international organization designed to promote vaccines. Mm-hmm. That is not an independent stance. You can't just release the data that is necessary to reach a conclusion to someone who has already reached a conclusion. That is not science. So control of information and, withholding information from public scrutiny is anti-science. Science has to have information. So science is, I agree, science is not everything, but it's one very, very important brick of society, of modern society especially, obviously. If we start to limit that, we start to say some scientists or some doctors are good and others are bad, we are into a sort of Orwellian attitude.
All right, so speaking of Orwellian attitude, and based on what we've discussed already, in your reference to the Herald article that you made earlier, the article reports that the government is funding a raft of clinical studies to gauge the impact of the pandemic. Each study will receive between $200,000 and $500,000. 23 government-funded studies, 23 of them, are listed. Incredibly, 14 of these funded studies focus on how to improve COVID vaccine uptake and reduce vaccine hesitancy. So in other words, the truth comes from here, and we're going to pursue that. Then 3 of the studies will focus on assessing long-term COVID outcomes. 5 studies will assess the impact of the government's pandemic response. And then comes the shocker. Just 1 study will examine vaccine safety. And you mentioned it a moment ago. But
go on.
It's like an inverted pyramid.
Yes, it is. It's hard to get around the idea that there's a sort of level of fanaticism here and a determination to push on whatever the data says with the program, regardless. Yeah, I mean that's the feeling that I think a lot of people have got about this pandemic and the pandemic response. And yeah, we've seen a lot of. There's been a political shift. A lot of power has been handed over to a medical perspective. And that perspective really excludes an element of choice. And, 50% of people here in New Zealand take natural health products. And if you read some of the articles in mainstream media, people who are interested in natural health products are identified as people who shouldn't really hold political office, or they're a bit strange, or that's 50% of the population.
Well, did that come from an individual or two, or was it a committee announcement, or what?
It's a tone of articles in the mainstream media that we've seen. And over the period of the pandemic, occasionally someone is, who is hesitant about vaccine and, they do yoga and that's to blame, or they're interested in well-being. That's dangerous. I've seen a lot of articles like that. I kept a track, actually, of all the terms that were used. I think the scientific point here is that actually there are studies during the pandemic that diet is a big factor in your ability to recover from pandemic. A lighter diet, so a pescatarian or a vegetarian diet, you have a 70% reduced chance of hospitalization after COVID. That's a study in the British Medical Journal. If you do exercise regularly, you, again, a very high reduction in your likelihood of being hospitalized. There have been studies on a number of anti-inflammatory herbs, things as simple as turmeric or ginger, that have a positive impact on COVID outcomes. Again, just simple things like going to bed on time really improve your outcomes.
So if you go to bed on time, whatever that is, and then you get up at 3 o'clock in the morning for 2 hours and then sort of wander back, is that bad?
The specific study I'm referring to is a study of health professionals in the UK. And what they found was that people who are working in hospitals, if they're on shift work, they have a far higher rate of hospitalization. I can't remember the exact percentage, but it was considerably higher. So people who are disturbing their circadian rhythms through undertaking rolling shift work, their immunity is to a certain extent obviously impaired by that.
Right.
Yeah, and there are other much bigger studies in terms of health involving millions of people that have been published over the last 10 years. If you eat 5 helpings of fresh fruit and vegetables in a day, then your chance of getting cancer is hugely reduced.
I was going to leave this till the very end, but it slots in here, so I'll utilize it. Based on your career experience of food testing and what have you, do you have thoughts on coffee?
Well, I'm allergic to coffee.
Yeah, you got thoughts on coffee. All right. So,
but I have a coffee machine here, and I'm happy to offer it to my guests because I think my problem with coffee is simply an individual problem that I have. It's not a philosophy.
Okay. Then, here's the reason for the question from the Epoch Times, who spend a lot of time writing about health matters. Anyway, research published in the European Journal of Preventive Cardiology on September 27 observed that amongst 450,000 adults with an average age of 58 over a 13-year period, that sipping 2 or 3 cups of coffee a day is linked with a longer lifespan and a lower risk of heart disease compared to avoiding it.
I haven't seen the study. I'd have to look at the study. That's one principle that I have.
Okay.
Is that I need to read the study and I need to read the supplementary material and look at the design of the study. And I think it's quite possible. I mean, coffee is something that's natural.
Let me just include this because I think it's important, seeing I've already mentioned it. Ground, instant, and decaffeinated coffee were associated with reductions in the incidence of and death from cardiovascular disease or any cause, according to the study author, Professor Peter Kistler of the Baker Heart and Diabetes Research Institute. And the results suggest that mild to moderate intake of coffee should be considered a part of a healthy lifestyle.
I wouldn't disagree with that. I wouldn't disagree with that.
The part I was looking for, and I can't see it immediately, but
like a lot of things, you don't want too much of a good thing. A glass of wine a day might be quite useful, but 2 bottles of wine a day might not be.
The point, what I was looking for was the fact that ground coffee, I just noticed it did include instant, but they emphasised somewhere ground coffee is the best.
It's this is one I've written a book, Your DNA Diet, and in there I look at a lot of published studies which tend to increasingly support the notion that the freshness of what you eat is quite important. And there are mechanisms whereby genetic information can actually support your health. So foods that contain genetic information, in my opinion, based on my analysis of research, and I have over 800 references in that book, are an important part of our health. So what worries me is that we have this tendency now towards synthetic foods. So in the supermarket, you'll now see expressions like natural vanilla flavor, and you'll think that you're eating vanilla bean or some part of a vanilla bean. But these days, very little of vanilla comes from a vanilla bean. It's made through biotechnology, and it's actually different from vanilla. It has a somewhat similar taste, but structurally it's different. It seems to me that we have co-evolved over millions of years with our genetic environment of plants, animals, food sources. It's a symbiotic relationship, and we need to preserve that. If we start to change everything about our relationship with the natural world and reject it in favor of various forms of technology, that could be endangering our health. We don't know.
You got any brief thoughts on a diet of insects?
Well, we have a lot of insects where I am. I'm sitting here in the middle of the bush, and I'm constantly being presented with a lot of insects, but I'm not eating them. Is it insects or is it highly processed insects? Because it's also clear from the research that ultra-processed foods are difficult for the body to digest and pose certain kinds of health issues. These are complex issues, but a variety and a high level of natural content in food, I think, is very important. And I think that's very protective for health. And in fact, I'd go so far as to say, as far as the pandemic is concerned, that 95% of our health comes from our lifestyle, our food that we eat, the fresh air that we breathe, the enjoyment that we take in life. These are the things that really underpin our health. There's a professor in Mangan, her name is Dr. Mangan, and she's in New Zealand here, and she's quite recognized internationally. But she found, for example, that for elderly people, if you cease all medications except those that are absolutely necessary. So many elderly people are on 5, 6, 7 different kinds of medications. If you cease all of them except the ones that are absolutely vital, their health improves.
Intriguing. So, I have 2 topics that I want to just raise with you briefly. Robert Malone, I would imagine you would have some sympathy with his viewpoints?
Oh, absolutely. Right. Yes. Well, I mean, he's a distinguished man. He's done a lot.
Not in some news outlets.
Well, we're not. Hopefully, we're not going to rely upon news outlets to evaluate people's achievements in science.
Sadly, a lot of people are deprived, I think, on getting to the facts and determining and being able to determine for themselves how they want to conduct their lives by being denied a lot of information. But he has written about the Washington Post big pharma propaganda on vitamin D. The pharmaceutical, biodefense, medical complex, working together with corporate media, has succeeded in putting vitamin D in a bad light through their own propaganda and misinformation campaigns. The general public continues to be left out in the dark. These are the same forces which have worked so hard to memory hole, forget, and even discredit the natural immunity which develops from infection and recovery from SARS-CoV-2 infection. Yes. I won't go any further because it's a 7-page piece. But where the hell have they got the idea, the right, the authority to start dissing vitamin D, for heaven's sake?
Well, we're lucky here in New Zealand because we get outdoors a lot. So, but the modern lifestyle, the kind of indoor lifestyle, in a different climate, of course, but in a different sort of age, has given a lot of people vitamin D deficiency. And, it's a natural part of our life, our immunity.
Yeah, but what the part I'm getting at is the Big Pharma and the Washington Post, etc., are dumping on it.
Well, the whole model of media has changed. The financial model of media has changed with the advent of online content and the reduction in advertising revenue. Media have had to look elsewhere for support, and they take a lot of support out of commercial ventures and translate that into articles and attitudes. And that's going on all over the world. The Washington Post can be a big culprit. I was looking at an article today from the Washington Post where they were looking at the statistics of very poor pregnancy outcomes in the US since the pandemic started. That means high levels of stillbirths, miscarriages, preeclampsia, and they blamed it all on COVID infection, but there was no evidence for that. And that, to me, is anti-science, because in order to decide what these poor pregnancy outcomes are caused by, you need to do research that distinguishes between the vaccinated and the unvaccinated. You can't scientifically hold an attitude that the vaccinated and the unvaccinated are in completely different positions. So the mainstream media idea is the vaccinated are protected, the unvaccinated are unprotected. The vaccinated have a good immune response, the unvaccinated have a poor immune response. By the way, I don't agree with it at all, and there's studies that show that. But you can't then sort of forget that in scientific studies or assessments and say, oh, well, everything is due to COVID. That's unscientific in my mind, and that's where the Washington Post has fallen down, and that's where our mainstream media in New Zealand has also fallen down. There's an assumption that everything is due to COVID, and that's a false assumption.
There are concerns of a surge in COVID-related heart disease following the Omicron outbreak. Cardiologists and GPs say they're seeing an increase in patients reporting heart problems after catching COVID.
Law student Myra Karunanudi was living her best life until she got COVID.
I thought it was going to be a mild illness, especially for someone like me. I'm 21, otherwise healthy, fit, I'm triple vaccinated, don't have any underlying health conditions.
But 10 weeks on from Omicron, she's struggling with heart palpitations and fatigue.
So I get a pounding and racing heart. My heart rate skyrockets to about 150 to 210 beats per minute just from quite minimal activity like walking, doing my hair.
Just making her bed or walking upstairs sends her heart rate shooting up to its maximum, while this time last year she was sprinting up hills and doing half marathons.
Experts are warning as many as 200,000 New Zealanders could be affected by long COVID just from the first wave of Omicron. It's been 3 months since case numbers really started ramping up. Some people still haven't recovered.
Ryan Johnston is a 32-year-old fully vaxxed, career-driven 5K run-a-day kind of guy. But 11 weeks on from getting COVID, he's still struggling with debilitating symptoms.
It's insomnia, it's heart issues, it's neurological issues.
Some research has shown a slight upswing in the number of people getting shingles.
If you've had a viral illness, it can stretch your immune system a little bit, and that may allow the shingles to come out, which is why this issue has arisen with COVID, because it's essentially a viral illness. So it just depresses the immune system a little bit.
Good news is, though, for people who are a little bit older, vaccines are available.
Exactly. So at the age of 65, there's now a free vaccine. You can get a jab.
Is that dictated from the podium?
It's hard to know. I mean, I have had conversations. I mean, I had a long email thread with Jesse Mulligan. And, he said, oh, well, I admire your work, but I can't interview you because vaccination is an obvious public good. These are his words. And anyone who says anything that would discourage anyone from getting vaccinated cannot have any airtime. So where did that come from? Was it dictated by his editors? Was it just a part of popular culture now?
No, it's dictated.
Probably. I mean, I have.
And then people subscribe to it because they don't have a choice, so they convince themselves that it's correct, if they had doubts in the first place.
I talked to David Fisher at the New Zealand Herald, and I asked him, is this an editorial policy? And he said, absolutely not. No, it's not. I'm just reaching sensible conclusions, and you're not. But if you read my articles, you'll see a lot of scientific references in my articles. And
let's leave it at the fact that some people shortchange themselves knowledge-wise.
Could be.
Now, the last, and I find this right up at the top with interest. A medical advisory group to the federal government has just recommended that all adult Americans aged 19 to 64 be screened for anxiety. Earlier this year, the US Preventive Services Task Force, which advises both the Department of Health and Human Services and Congress, recommended anxiety screening for children 8 to 18. One could see this coming. The ultimate pandemic is now life itself. It's hard to know whether the recommendation of mass anxiety screening should be met with satire or chagrin. What took them so long? The idea that we live in an age of anxiety has been common since at least W.H. Auden's book-length poem with that title appeared in 1947. In 1993, the psychiatrist Peter Kramer produced a best-selling book, Listening to Prozac, a meditation on the implications of the quickly adopted antidepressant drug approved in 1987. One more little paragraph. The task force's recommendation that virtually all adults be screened for anxiety will be signified if support builds for its adoption as standard care. That would move what most people consider a recurring condition of life, such as happiness or sadness, closer to something that would be submissible for control by formal institutions, including the state. The question is, will this make us better or worse? But the reason I wanted to include that is because I was talking to a very good friend only yesterday who was telling me of what he's dealing with at the moment. Someone that he's very close to had a total nervous breakdown very recently. That person lives in London but flew to Australia and for reasons. And after the reasons were dealt with, there was a death in the family. And then immediately had a complete mental collapse and has not been able to return to London at this point. The other two people are both women who, reasons that I'm not familiar with, have had mental collapses and are suffering. Now, that's just three from one source. And he was telling me about the anxiety that all three of these people, the first one's obvious, but the other two, they're just overwhelmed with anxiety about what's going on in the world. Everything that's being thrown at them by the news media and social media. And it's having this major effect. And I suspect, for other reasons, that it's much broader than that.
I have heard reports that during the lockdown that suicides have increased and that domestic violence has increased. And clearly the government has played a role. Governments all over the world have played a role in stoking fear and anxiety. I often say myself as a personal philosophy that there's nothing to take seriously except the joy of life. I don't think Prozac, well, I know that Prozac is not a solution. When you look at drugs intended to control anxiety, you'll find, if you look in the small print of the side effects, that generally the long-term outcome of dependency on drugs designed to treat anxiety is, in fact, increases in anxiety. As a long-term outcome, they're not successful. I personally, I do meditation. I have done most of my life. I learned when I was at university. I do meditation for a few minutes morning and evening. It helps me enormously. And I think, you're right. But this tendency to come up with a pharmaceutical solution has been there, especially in America. We have a friend, a young girl, who went to one of the top Ivy League universities, and it was routine. And this was not too long ago, maybe 8 years ago or so. It was routine to put all the students on medication like Ritalin, just routine.
Wow!
You go and see the campus physician, enroll there as a new university student, and they say, "Why don't you try Ritalin? It's very helpful for people who are under pressure, because these are Ivy League, it's high pressure stuff." Well, yes, wow, I agree. If you know people who've been on long-term anxiety medication or other kinds of drugs, then the long-term outcomes are just not great.
Only time will tell, I guess.
Oh, the state should never, Leighton, the state interfering to this level in medical choices, it's unacceptable, it's unbelievable.
I would go further, Guy. It's criminal.
Yes. If there is known to be harm, as with a great number of these kinds of medications, there is known to be long-term harm, and if it's insisted upon, then it has, as we said before, broken the social compact. There are lots of things that the individual is quite capable of deciding for themselves, that the government is now assuming in an overreach of power that they should be deciding for the individual. And that, to me, is the beginning of a path, of a road that we really don't want to go down.
On that note, I will say it's been a pleasure talking with you.
Thank you. And Leighton, it was a very great pleasure talking to you. We've covered a lot of topics, and I think these things need to be aired. So, again, thank you for raising questions, asking questions. That's what life is about. When we stop asking questions, we've stopped living.
Again, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
It's been a pleasure.